All right, this week we are jumping into sex and power and some more detail and engagement about how some of the mechanisms of power and laws and things like that have come to impact the current and past understandings of what counts as good and bad or natural or unnatural sex. So before we jump into working through some of the stuff for this week, I wanted to just note that the Gail Rubin Thinking Sex article is a difficult reading, and so if you are struggling with it a little bit more than some of the other readings, that is totally okay. Just do your best. And this week in the lecture, I'm really going to just walk through some of the key points from that article to pull them out so that you can read and pull some of the things out yourself as well. I also want to say that this article was first published in 1984, which was a few years ago now. And so it is both a theoretical document in that it gives us information and theories about how to understand sex and social stratification, but it also is a historical document that is very much a product of its time. So a lot of the references may be dated, and the terminology as well might not be in line with what we would use today. So just keep that in mind. And as always, you are not expected to agree with everything that is put forth in the class or in the readings, and that I just want to note that this reading might be particularly challenging in that she is really going to cut to some of the deep-seated understandings and taboos and moral foundations for our understandings of sex and sexuality. So with that said, let's get started. So as I said, Thinking Sex was first published in 1984 by Gail Rubin, and this article argues that the disputes over sexual behavior, they often become the vehicles for displacing other social anxieties. And so in times where there's a lot of social stress or strife, sexual behavior and sexual practices often become the place that this anxiety gets focused at a social level. And that might be something that feels relevant to our current moment, but we'll also see a lot of times over the history of Western civilization where that becomes where sexual behavior or sexualized minorities become the focus in times where there's a lot of other stuff and change happening in society. And so she talks about these historical periods where sexuality becomes very sharply contested, where it's a real focus of social life, that oftentimes the result of this focus and this contestation is that what it means and our understandings of sexuality and erotic life, as she calls it, gets renegotiated in oftentimes very big and sweeping ways. And it is through these struggles that we have in these times of contestation over sexuality. She says they leave a residue in the form of laws, social practices, and ideologies that affect how we understand and experience sexuality a long, long time after those specific conflicts may have faded. And she talks about a number of periods where sexuality has been struggled over in a very deep and meaningful way, in the 1880s, the 1950s, and then of course in her current moment when she's writing in the 1980s. And we might think about if today or the sort of recent past is also a space, is one of those historical periods in which sexuality is much more sharply contested. And because of these traces, these laws and changes in social practices that occur, we can still see the effects of things and struggles in the 1880s and the 1950s that still impact the way we experience sexuality today. And so that's sort of her introduction, her framing of what she's going to be doing. And you can see those numbers in parentheses are the page numbers that correspond to your readings for those quotes, so if you're following along there. And that the rest of the article largely focuses on how this happens, like what are the mechanisms through which these residues take place, and how is it that these ideas and these struggles happen? What underpins them? What are some of the assumptions? And so she's going to do that through talking about some different historical and contemporary, at least contemporary to her, examples. If we remember, she's writing in the 1980s, so what will feel largely like all historical examples for those of us reading today. And ultimately, Rubin's goal is to develop what she calls a radical theory of sex, which she says must identify, describe, explain, and denounce erotic injustice and oppression. So she is really thinking about justice and how do we work towards a world in which sexual expression is not stigmatized, and for the most part, there are a few exceptions to that, but where people are on much more equal footing, where sexual marginalization doesn't occur. So in order to understand how we got to this place where we are of different identities or behaviors being marginalized in different ways, Rubin talks about some pervasive assumptions in Western society about sexuality that really underpin most of our ideas and perceptions around sexual behavior. The first of which is what she calls sexual essentialism. And that's the idea that sex is a natural force that exists prior to social life and shapes institutions. So this idea that sex and sexuality is something innately biological and or internally like an individual psychology issue. And she says this assumption means that sex is perceived as eternally unchanging, asocial, and transhistorical, which of course in a sociology class are things that we are trying to break down and think about sex as social. And so essentially her saying that the assumption of sexual essentialism means that we don't think about sex as socially constructed in the way that we're trying to do so in this class. Another assumption or underpinning is what she calls sex negativity, and so we've talked about sex positivity in this class. So she is saying that the general assumption around sexuality in Western culture is one that is sex negative, that we generally consider sex to be dangerous, destructive, a negative force, and that we usually treat sex with suspicion. And she talks about sex being presumed guilty until proven innocent, so inverting our usual understanding of what is happening in the law, that we are presumed innocent until proven guilty. She says when it comes to sex and sexuality, that the behaviors that are on trial, so to speak, are often presumed guilty until proven innocent. Another really important concept and assumption that Rubin talks about is this fallacy of misplaced scale. And she says this is generally the idea that sexuality and sex is burdened with an excess of significance, in that these small differences in behavior, like what whole or body parts do you like to have sex with, which would be generally considered potentially a small difference, become these cosmic threats that basically any sexual difference gets blown way out of proportion, and that we just place too much emphasis and significance on sex. And so anything that has to do with sex, even if it's a relatively benign difference, becomes a opportunity or a place for lots of moral pearl clutching or hand wringing around the issue or the behavior. She also talks about Western culture having a hierarchical system of sexual value, so meaning that not all sexual behaviors or identities are valued equally. There's a hierarchy. Some sexual acts are valued more than others, and she names marital, reproductive heterosexuals as being alone atop the erotic pyramid, so that basically marital sex in the context of marriage for the purpose of reproduction with a heterosexual couple is often seen as the ideal or the most valued form of sexual engagement, and everything else sort of falls beneath that. And she goes through on page 151 generally who sort of falls where in the sexual hierarchy, certainly in her reading of the cultural norms in the 1980s. In terms of sort of having a better sense of what this hierarchical system of sexual value looks like, she gives us two examples that are visual, and both of these are posted on canvas as images so that you can take a look at them. The first one is this charmed circle of sexuality, which basically gives us a general version of the sexual value system as she sees it in 1984. So we might think about, has this charmed circle changed in the intervening 30 plus years since Rubin wrote this article? So basically, the way that she explains this is that the aspects of sex and sexuality that are on the inside, the charmed circle, those are the things that are considered good, natural, normal, and the more of those pieces on the inside of the circle that whatever sexual act has, the better it is. So the best form of sexual engagement would be coupled, heterosexual, married sex in a monogamous relationship that is for the purposes of procreation. No money is exchanged. The people involved are of the same generation. It takes place at home and likely even in the bedroom, that there's no pornography. It's just bodies. There's no sex toys or anything. And the type of sex is very vanilla, so some sort of missionary position or similarly what vanilla sort of expression. And if you have all of those things, that is like the best form. That's the top of the sexual hierarchy. And the fewer of those things you have, or the more things you have in a particular act that include things on those outer limits, the more bad or dirty or shameful or unnatural it is perceived to be. That's not to say that it is, but is perceived to be by society. And so thinking about like the use of sex toys, any sort of BDSM practices, gay sex or homosexual sex, is it outside the context of wedlock or a monogamous relationship? Is it purely for pleasure and not for procreation? Is there an exchange of money? Are you alone, or are there more than just two people involved? Where does it take place? All sorts of stuff. And so this is one way of visualizing some of that sexual value or sexual hierarchy. Another way that Rubin gives us to visualize this idea of a sexual hierarchy is around where we draw the line as a society between what good sex and bad sex look like. And so there is the sort of wall image, and on one side of the wall or the line are the things that are considered good sex, so heterosexual, married, monogamous, reproductive, at home, basically all those things that are on the inside of that charmed circle. And then as we move to the right, you see we sort of go downhill, both metaphorically and visually, to where more questionable or areas of contestation. So there's sort of political and social discussion over whether this is good or bad sex. So in the middle there, we have unmarried heterosexual couples, promiscuous heterosexuals, masturbation, long-term and stable lesbian and gay couples, lesbians in the bars, promiscuous gay men at a bath or at the park, and then to the far right, we have here listed transvestites, transsexuals, which in our current parlance, we would probably use the terms cross-dressers or transgender people, fetishists, so folks who are into shoes or feet or baby play or whatever it is, sadomasochism, folks that are having sex for money, and cross-generational sex, which in our legalized, criminalized parlance would be pedophilia, or the sort of the psychological terminology for that. So folks who are having sex either with young people, or generally this also could be two adults, but for example, somebody in their 30s and somebody in their 60s. And so the question or the arguments here are where to draw the line, what sort of gets to be on the acceptable side of the line of sex, and what has to stay on the non-acceptable side of sexuality. Going back to Rubin's assumptions that underpin Western ideas about sexuality, she talks about the domino theory of sexual peril. And it helps to think about the metaphor here. So if we think about dominoes and you line them up all in a row on their end, and you hit one on the end, the whole stack falls down. And you may have seen commercials or done that as a child, and you sort of line them all up and you hit one on the end and the whole thing tumbles. That's a similar idea to thinking about this line that we looked at in the last slide over what divides good sex from bad sex. The idea if that one thing gets over the line that's on that bad sex side and gets, we allow that one thing to come over the line, maybe unmarried heterosexual couples or monogamous gay and lesbian couples, even if those things that feel very close to the line, but maybe in terms of at least Rubin's reading of culture at the time, were still on the bad side, that if even those couple of things, then everything just descends into chaos and everything and anything is permissible and acceptable. This domino theory was something that was used in the Korean and Vietnam Wars in regards to trying to stop the spread of communism. So one of the main reasons that was given about getting into both the Korean and Vietnam Wars is if one of these countries in Southeast Asia falls to communism, then like a stack of dominoes, they're all going down, and soon America will be the only democratic nation in the world. That clearly has not happened. And we can also see this in sexuality, a more recent example in the debates about gay marriage that were happening in the early 2000s up through the 20-teens. There was some opponents to same-sex marriage that were talking about, well, if we allow two men to get married or two women to get married, then marriage won't mean anything, and we'll have to let people get married to their dogs and their rabbits and their toasters and fruit salad, and everything will just be chaos. So I would argue we haven't seen that pan out either, but this idea that there's sort of a slippery slope around sexuality is one of the pervasive assumptions about how we understand sexuality and social hierarchies. The last assumption that she talks about is really more of a lack of assumption that Rubin states that we don't really have a concept of benign variation around sexuality, it's really hard to understand the fact that people just have different sexual preferences and do different sexual things, and none of it's really any better or worse than the other, that it's all just kind of benign, right? It's fine, and it's all just variation. This is you might hear echoes of Alfred Kinsey's work here when he was looking for the variety of variation in human sexual expression, and the backlash that he got for challenging and sort of putting up the idea that there might just be benign sexual variation. And colloquially, we might think about the concept of benign sexual variation in the phrase, "don't yuck my yum," right? Like, I might like something, you might not like it, but you don't have to shame me or say that I'm gross or say that I shouldn't do it, and vice versa. There's probably things that we all do in our lives that other people might find gross or not prefer over other things. And she uses the metaphor of cuisine or taste, right? Like, I might really enjoy a certain type of cuisine, and you might think it's not good, that it doesn't taste very good, but just because we differ on our taste in food doesn't mean that you're trying to tell me that my interest in Mexican food is illegal, or that I should be denied access to services and not be able to teach because I like Mexican food and you don't like Mexican food. So the next big section of Rubin's article is around the larger social transformation on how we understand sexuality. And she and other scholars have argued that there's a key transformation in how we understand this starting in the 19th century or the 1800s that really gains speed over that century and into the earliest 20th century. She talks about this as erotic speciation. So thinking about like species, like animal species, and that folks with different sexual preferences or practices, we started to think about them as different species or subgroups of people. And so there's a famous line among academics from Michel Foucault, who's a French scholar, that says the sodomite, a person who had anal sex, or a man who had sex with men anally, the sodomite had been a temporary aberration. It was something just that he did. It was a practice. It may not have been approved of, but that it was just sort of a thing that people did. So the sodomite had been been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species. So a shift from just, here's a sexual behavior that you engage in, which may or may not be approved of and may or may not be legal, but it didn't really say anything about who you were as a person, as opposed to now, the homosexual or a gay person was now a species. It had something fundamentally to do with how you were categorized as a person. And so Rubin talks about sexuality now functioning as a quasi-ethnic group. So in a way that similar, we think about different racial or ethnic groups. We also think about sexuality in similar ways, right? So we can see this in the proliferation of all the letters of the acronym, where we think about gay people and lesbians and bisexual folks and transgender folks and pansexuals and asexuals and all the different groups that now seem to have at least a loose association with one another in terms of a culture and how we see them and their role in society. And she links this to the growing industrialization and urbanization of the West, especially the United States, and we've talked about that a little bit a few times, and she'll go into more depth on that in the reading. She also talks about some of the different ways through which social stratification and sexual conformity are upheld. So things like sex or vice laws, obscenity laws, age of consent laws, some bureaucratic regulations. She gives the example of immigration policy, but that these are also social practices, but it's also things that medical or psychiatric professionals are upholding in various ways through things like diagnostic criteria and what counts as a mental illness or doesn't, and then of course families as a key component in how we uphold these ideas about sexual stratification and sexual conformity. And ultimately her argument here is that sex and or sexuality is a vector of social oppression, similar to race, to gender, to social class, and other things, which was a somewhat radical claim for the time. It's something I think we sort of take for granted now, but was really, when she was writing this, still a somewhat new thing to be thinking about in society. The last thing I want to get to today, because I know this lecture is running a little bit longer than we usually have them, about moral panics. And Gail Rubin talks about moral panics in the section of the text that I'm not asking you to read, but I did want to make sure that I touched on it because it is important for our understanding of how all of this works and some of the mechanisms through which sexual hierarchy and sexual stratification are come into being and are reinforced. And so Gail Rubin talks about moral panics as the political moment of sex in which a lot of diffuse attitudes, so like feelings that people had or beliefs that people have sort of in individual or in small groups, are then channeled into political action, and then from there they're channeled into social change. And so this section is on 163 if you'd like to do a little bit of extra reading this week and take a look at that. And the important thing about moral panics is that although the target population suffers very deeply, whoever's sort of being mobilized against, but that all of us are affected by the social and legal changes that result from these moral panics. So it's not just the problem of a small minority, it really is something we all should be concerned about. And she talks about a few different aspects of moral panics. One is this mass hysteria over a perceived sexual threat. And so the idea that in the 1970s, the existence of gay people, of homosexuals, was a perceived sexual threat. And so we had this sort of mass hysteria. There was a lot of news coverage. There was a lot of mobilizing. There was a lot of fear. Often moral panics come with these invented victims. And so the idea that about like gay people as public school teachers or as teachers in general, the idea that gay people should not be allowed to be teachers because they would recruit and convert young people to a homosexual lifestyle, or that they would be sexually abusing children because of the conflation of homosexuality and pedophilia at the time. But there were no actual people that came forward, or children who came forward and said, yes, this is a thing that happened to me. The victims were always sort of invented. There was not an actual flesh and blood person who had been subject to that necessarily. Often moral panics are based on this domino theory of sexual peril, right? If we let this thing persist, or if we allow this to be okay, everything else will go just devolve into chaos. Often the other social anxieties about change in the world are redirected towards scapegoats who are then the victims. And so wider visibility of LGBT people brought up anxiety about the naturalness of heterosexuality, about the power that heteronormative structures gave to heterosexual people that was being challenged, and really questioning sort of the naturalness of sexuality in general and whether or not heterosexuality was such a preordained total thing that it had been thought to be. And so gay people who were sort of causing folks to question the normalcy or the naturalness of heterosexuality as the only proper way to be a sexual person, gay people then became scapegoats for those fears and anxiety. And most importantly, Rubin talks about how these moral panics leave residue in these laws and institutions that then impact us for many, many years, if not decades or even centuries to come. And so just a few examples of some moral panics. Victorian era, the 1880s and such, we have a lot of moral panic around prostitution, or what was sometimes called white slavery and sex trafficking, which resulted in laws that still impact us in a few different ways or shapes and forms today, but also moral panics around masturbation, or what was called onanism, that was feared to cause everything from stunted growth to blindness. And so even now we see traces of that fear and misinformation about masturbation in our culture today. In the 1950s, we're really thinking about concerns about homosexuality and sex offenders, and often to the point that those two were conflated and became synonymous. The 1970s, we have growing concerns about queerness and the growing visibility of LGBT communities, about prostitution and about obscenity and pornography. And then in the 2000s, I would argue that we've had moral panics about same-sex marriage, but that transgender identities really seem to be the focus of sort of sexualized or sex and gender panics, moral panics, especially with the rhetoric we're seeing around bathrooms and especially trans women in women's restrooms, just simply, opening up women, other women, cisgender women, to sexual violence. Again, these sort of imagined victims in the case. So just a thing to sort of note that many of these anxieties around sex and sexuality have really been centered on protecting children and childhood innocence. And so thinking about some of the way childhood and innocence is been socially constructed, but also the refusal to really acknowledge childhood sexuality, and that children often have sexual desires or have sexual curiosities that we would prefer not to think about at all. So that was a lot for this week, but I hope this helps clarify or open up some lines of inquiry into how we've gotten to this place that we are, and the ways and the mechanisms through which our different understandings and value systems around sex and sexuality have been shaped. And that's it for this week. Have a good week. We'll check in next week with our next topic.